Então vamos lá, gente. Boa noite. Boa noite a todos. Queria agradecer a presença de vocês hoje aqui. É muito importante para a gente, num momento em que a gente está passando, a universidade está passando por tantas dificuldades, né, em que a gente está sendo tão atacado, principalmente aqui a área das humanidades. É muito importante ver esse auditório cheio, praticamente lotado. Então é um prazer enorme, agradeço muitíssimo a presença de vocês, que mostra mais uma vez que a gente está produzindo ciência, sim, e de altíssima qualidade. Então, muito obrigada. Vou começar convidando à mesa o nosso palestrante de hoje. Por favor, Yuki Hui, por favor, pode sentar aqui à mesa. In English, please. So I would like to invite you to sit here in our table. And also, Ronaldo Lemos, por favor. Fazer os agradecimentos rapidamente. Então, esse evento, ele é uma parceria do programa de pós-graduação de comunicação aqui da UFRJ, com o programa de pós-graduação em comunicação, arte e computação da Universidade Federal do Paraíba, do ITS, Instituto de Tecnologia e Sociedade do Rio de Janeiro. Sem essa parceria, esse evento também não seria possível, então, muitíssimo obrigada. Queria agradecer também ao apoio do Fórum de Ciência e Cultura, a Tatiana Roque, que é a atual coordenadora, mas também alguns nomes: Karina, Marcelos, Walter Ney, Alexandre, Magno, Maurício. Agradecer também a equipe do ITS, a Renata Guedes e o Fábio Steibel, a equipe do PPG-Com, Bia Morgado e o Bernardo Giralta, a equipe do Media Lab, o Paulo Faltai, o Marlos Araújo e a Ana Bentes. Então, a gente tem patrocínio também da CAPES envolvido e de outros apoiadores também da Paraíba, a Fundação da Paraíba, né, de apoio à pesquisa. Então, muito obrigada pelo apoio. Então, para a mesa de hoje, eu vou fazer uma rápida apresentação do nosso palestrante, Yuki Hui, formado em Engenharia e Computação e Filosofia na Universidade de Hong Kong, na Goldsmiths College, professor do Instituto de Filosofia e Arte da Universidade de Lofana, em Lunenburg. Atualmente é professor na Bauhaus e Universidade de Weimar. E também professor visitante na Academia de Artes da China, onde ministra um curso anual com Bernard Stiegler. Foi nomeado agora em 2019 professor associado da Escola de Mídia Criativa da City University em Hong Kong, pesquisador associado no Instituto de Cultura e Estética da Mídia, pesquisador de pós-doutorado no Instituto de Pesquisa e Inovação no Centro Pompidou e cientista visitante nos laboratórios Dutch Telecom em Berlim. São diversas as publicações em revistas importantes. Editor dos 30 anos, 30 Years After Les Immatériaux, autor de On the Existence of Digital Objects, The Question Concerning Technology in China, Recursivity and Contingency. Seus escritos, textos foram traduzidos em diversas línguas. Aqui no Brasil a gente tem, por enquanto, né, uma única tradução, publicada pela N-1, na caixa Pandemia de Cordéis. O texto é o Da Consciência Infeliz dos Neorreacionários. Junto, para compor a mesa e fazer também um trabalho de mediação, nós temos o Ronaldo Lemos, mestre em Direito por Harvard, doutor pela USP, professor de Política e Tecnologia da Universidade de Colômbia, diretor e fundador do ITS Rio. Então, eu deixo vocês aqui com essa maravilhosa mesa. Tenhamos uma excelente noite. Muito obrigada.
Professor Hui, I'm going to speak for 5 minutes and then I'll give the floor to you because I think that's everyone, including myself, wants to do here. I'll be speaking in English for the sake of precision. First of all, it's really amazing to see this room completely full. and to see so many familiar faces, important faces for the debate of technology in Brazil. It's impossible to name everyone that I think it makes me really happy to be here. But I think Professor's Roy visit is something that is very important for Brazil in the moment. As you know, Brazil is suffering in the political system the consequences of technology usage. The last two electoral processes in Brazil had the use of technology as a central issue in terms of how the public sphere was reconfigured, and we are living the consequences of that reconfiguration. So more than ever, we need to look for ideas and models and political philosophy and philosophy itself to understand where we are, where we came from in terms of the technology, where should we go, and what are the moral and political choices that we have ahead of us because of technology. So I really think that the visit of Professor Roy to Brazil will be the beginning of a school of reflection about those issues. And I really think you're going to have roots in Brazil, and you'll be most likely invited to come here many other times, because a lot of people will not only work after you, but they will also become interlocutors to what you have been writing. And I could not emphasize enough the importance of Professor Roy's work in the world of today. And one of the reasons that I actually wrote when I wrote a very short review at Folha de São Paulo newspaper about his work in Brazil is that when you look at the philosophy of technology in the West, and particularly in the United States, at least in my view, there is a sense of defeat. We've been defeated by technology. So this defeatism, in which we call this defeatism by different names. Some people call it the singularity. Some people even built a university around this defeatism. And when you talk about that, it's basically you're assuming that technology has put humans, humanity, and existence of the organic in the second place, and that we are doomed to be governed by another sort of existing objects that will basically, most of them be digital, as Professor Roy investigated, and our place in the cosmos will be mediated by those technologies. So when I read everyone talking about the singularity, or Danny Hillis about the end of the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment has come to an end, I'm really worried, because it's a sort of a view that is very impoverishing, and a view that ignores the fact that the demons are still there. So when you think about the Chinese culture, it's very important to understand that there is this idea about demons interfering in the human space, and the cosmos having an integration and an interference as well in our lives. And in my view, technology will not send the demons away. We will have to continue to work with them. We will have to continue to dealing with the fact that we live in a planet, in a cosmos. We will have to deal with complexity that is not going to go away, but is actually going to become even more intricate. And so I'm really skeptical about this reductionism. And that's when I first got in touch with Professor Roy's work. And when I read it for the first time, I was really, for the lack of a better word, enlightened. Because I really think it's it's something that emerges between the East and the West. The dialogue that Professor Roy proposes between the East and the West, I think it's very important and profound. And we are talking here about something that is very important, which is our mode of existence. How do we want to exist in this world right now in the face of technology and in the face of the technology changes that we have ahead of us? So these, of course, are all questions. It's something that I've been thinking and I've been worried, especially because in Brazil we are living through the consequences of these issues. But I'm really, really still optimist, and I think I will ever be an optimist. I've always been throughout my work, and I will continue to be. And this optimism keeps, in my view, this flame still existing in terms of how we can not let go of agency, we can not let go of humanity and its belonging into the cosmos as a sort of approaching this very hard question that I think humanity has ahead of it, which is precisely the fact that technology has become the centerpiece for the way that human society organizes. So just to conclude, before this talk began, I was talking with Professor Roy, and we were talking about technology being dangerous. And one thing that I talked with him was basically that it's universally dangerous, in the sense that at this moment right now, we are having to find with our imagination ways of how we can build ways around it and ways with it and ways beyond it in such a way that was never necessary before. So with that, I will conclude. And once again, I think all of you that are sharing this moment with me right now probably feel the importance that Professor Roy's visit represents to Brazil at the moment. So we might all be rejoicing and happy to have him here, and we look very much forward to hearing you and also to exchanging ideas and following your way of thinking after this talk. So thank you guys very much. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and to Professor as well. And I would like to thank everyone for coming. I'm really surprised, but also very much honored to see so many people here, and also people I very much wanted to meet, like Professor Velez de Castro. And let me see if it worked. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, of course, I also need to thank the different parties who make this conference, my visit, possible. But there are so many parties, I forget their names. So I specifically wanted to thank the ECO ITS, but also colleagues from João Pessoa, who makes this visit possible. And the talk that I wanted to that I'm going to deliver this evening is not so much about China. It's not so much about my second book, but rather my recent book. Of course, they're all related in one way or another. It is my latest book, Recursivity and Contingency, which is a work I try to propose in the last paragraph of my book, the possibility of a post-European philosophy, and how can this be thought through technology. So I would like to start with one quote, and this quote is from Martin Heidegger's 1964 essay, "The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking." Maybe we can do it together. The end of philosophy proves to be the triumph of the manipulable arrangement of a scientific technological world and of the social order proper to this world. The end of philosophy means beginning of the world civilization based upon Western European thinking. This is something that I have read many, many years ago, but I didn't really pay attention to this paragraph until a few years ago that it attracted my attention. And in my conference in Joao Pessoa, I have discussed the second meaning of at the end of philosophy. That is the beginning of the world civilization based upon Western European thinking, and that is about geopolitics. Now today I would like to focus on the first part of the first meaning that Heidegger gives to the end of philosophy, the triumph of the manipulable arrangement of a scientific technological world and the social order proper to this world. So, which actually what he means here is cybernetics. Cybernetics means the end of philosophy. But the question that is urgent for us is what to begin or where to begin after the end of philosophy announced by Heidegger. But first of all, we need to understand what does it really mean by the end of philosophy and how did we come to this end before we can figure out or before we can even ask the question where to start. So this is the context of my talk and the talks of this visit. And to begin the subject for today, after the organic, I would like to open this lecture with two epigraphs that I used for my latest book, Recursivity and Contingency. The first one is from Immanuel Kant, and the other from Martin Heidegger again. We can read here, Kant. One can regard the history of the human species in the large as the completion of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an inwardly and to this end also an externally perfect state constitution as the only condition in which it can fully develop all its predispositions in humanity. From Kant's idea for universal history with a cosmopolitan aim. Second quote, second epigraph, from Heidegger's notorious Black Notebook. It might very well still take a considerable time to recognize that the organism and the organic present themselves as the mechanistic technological triumph of modernity over the domain of growth, nature. Both quotations address the concept of the organic, but in two significantly different ways. First of all, they are from two very different epochs, and therefore also reflect different tasks upon which thinking takes up as a response to its epoch. And for Kant, it was an epoch in which the concept of the organic became a powerful conceptual tool against the Cartesian mechanism which has triumphed philosophy since the 17th century in Europe. We can probably say so without exaggeration that mechanism was the condition of philosophizing which characterized the early modern European thought. By condition of philosophizing, I mean that thinking has to assimilate to this condition and work in accordance with it. After Kant, for philosophy to exist, it will have to become organic. While for Heidegger, it was an epoch in which cybernetics stands for the end and the accomplishment of Western philosophy, and in which European modernity also came to its end as completion. As he said, the world civilization is now based on Western European thought. This concept of the organic from Kant to Heidegger, as I would like to argue, obliges us to identify a new condition of philosophizing and therefore the task of thinking today after Heidegger. But what exactly has happened in Kant and in Heidegger? And how can you articulate this new condition of philosophizing? And I really wanted to emphasize on this term, the new condition of philosophizing. And what is the role of technology in this new condition? That is what I hope to clarify in this talk. Immanuel Kant's understanding of the organic is largely spelled out in the Critique of Judgment, a book divided into two parts. The first part, aesthetic judgment, concerning the beautiful and the sublime. The second part, teleological judgment, concerning organism and nature. The two forms of judgment repose on a specific operation and structure, which were vaguely called reflective judgment. A reflective judgment for Kant has to be distinguished from a determinate judgment, which is the determinate judgment is the foundation of the Critique of Pure Reason, a book dedicated to the grounding of a transcendental logic and the conditional possibility of cognition itself. A determinate judgment is one that subsumes the particular to the universal laws, like the subsumption of sense data to the 12 categories in the understanding. I can recognize this object, for example, this glass of water in front of me, because these data are subsumed to the categories so that the process of schematization can take place and give us the concept of such an object, the glass. A reflective judgment is fundamentally different because it does not subsume the particular to the universal. The universal is not given, is not pre-given, but rather it attempts to derive its own rules from the particular, a necessary passage from the particular to the universal. A reflective judgment is one that is open to contingency, which is necessary for its own determination by going back to itself. This circular movement, reflective judgment, which is not merely repetition, but rather what I would like to call recursive. It designates a new operation and a new structure. A determinate judgment is mechanical or mechanistic. But what does it mean that something is mechanical or mechanistic? When we say something is mechanistic, it doesn't merely mean that it is or it is part of a machine. Mechanical has to be understood in terms of linear causality. A linear causality suggests that when there is an effect, there must be a cause prior to it. And this cause is distinguished from the effect itself. A linear causality is finite. Otherwise, it would merit what Hegel calls bad infinity. But like what Aristotle has already emphasized in Book A of Metaphysics that I quote, those who maintain the infinite series destroy the good without knowing it. Yet no one would try to do anything if he were not going to come to a limit, end of quote. Because if the series is infinite, then there is no telos. And insofar as the telos is not concerned, there is no good. Therefore, Aristotle demands a prime mover, which is the unconditional cause, meaning that it is not the effect of another cause. This linearity characterizes what was called mechanistic today, and it was incarnated in the Cartesian mechanism. We know that for Descartes, mechanism is a monism which governs all beings. If you remember the second meditation of his meditation on first philosophy, Descartes has raised a question. He asks, are the people passing by his window not automata powered by spring wearing coat and hat? In order to give life to the mechanical body, Descartes proposes a soul sitting in the pineal gland in the brain, and it is able to give commands to the mechanical body. This linear causality was best illustrated with a spring-driven clock, in which the movement of one gear leads to another and finally set the whole complex into motion. Mechanism, as we all know today, fails to explain life because it attempts to explain life without life. The Cartesian mechanism was countered by the Spinozist immanent cause, which has to be distinguished from a transitive cause, meaning a linear and external causality. An immanent causation means a self-causation. The prime mover of the unmoved mover of Aristotle is a figure of linear causality, because if causes are limited, and if one can trace upstream, then there must be a first cause. However, in the nonlinear causation, here we associate with what Kant called reflection. The prime mover can only be understood as the totality of the being itself, namely it is immanent. In contrary to the clock, an organism demonstrates this new form of operation and structure, which cannot be exhausted by mechanical causality. Therefore, we see the Immanuel Kant of what is called the pre-critical period wrote. It is astonishing that something like an animal body should even be possible. And even if I could fully understand all its springs and pipes, which he referred to Descartes, all its nerves, ducts, and levers, its entire mechanical organization, I should still continue to be amazed. Nor, indeed, is the ground of my amazement removed once I have convinced myself that all the unity and harmony I observe around me is only possible because a being exists which contains within it the grounds not only of reality but also of all possibilities. End of quote. How can something like an animal body be possible? The irreducibility between the mechanical and the organic leads to two major interpretations after Immanuel Kant. One is organicism, and it is the subject that we'll focus on in this talk. The other one is organology, associated with philosophers such as Henri Bergson, Georges Canguilhem, Gilbert Simondon, and also Bernard Stiegler, which we may only be able to address if we have time during the discussion. For Immanuel Kant, the clearest definition of the organic form could be found in paragraph 46 of the Critique of Judgment, where he defines the organic being as following, I quote, "A thing exists as a natural end if it is, though in a double sense, both cause and effect of itself." Kant then provides example of a tree. Firstly, the tree reproduces itself according to its genus, meaning that it reproduces another tree. Secondly, the tree produces itself as an individual, absorbing energy from the environment and turning them into nutrients to sustain its life. Thirdly, different parts of the tree establish reciprocal relations and thus constitutes the whole, as Kant writes. I quote, "The preservation of one part is reciprocally dependent on the preservation of the other part." End of quote. The concept of the organic being consists in the reciprocal relations between parts and the whole and the capacity of reproduction. He also affirmed the two important categories of relations that Kant discussed in Critique of Purism, namely community, Gemeinschaft, and reciprocity, Wechselwirkung. In other words, they constitute a primary form of self-organization, as Kant writes, I quote again, "Nature, on the contrary, organizes itself and does so in each species of its organized products, following a single pattern, certainly as to a general features, but nevertheless admitting deviations calculated to secure self-preservation under particular circumstances. These two concepts, community and reciprocity, also characterize Kant's political philosophy, which we can vaguely identify with help of Hannah Arendt in her lectures on Kant's political philosophy. And that is this quote we read here. If the history of the human species is a completion of a hidden plan of nature, then it is so because this plan is organic and teleological, which ensures community and reciprocity through a republican constitution. That was Kant's political proposal. Therefore, we see that Kant's notion of the organic is not simply a mode of operation, but rather that which conditions all territories of philosophical thinking, practical reason, aesthetic judgment, and cosmopolitanism. This short excursion allows us to see how the concept of the organic, which came largely from the naturalist and the physiologist of the 18th century, now in Europe, not only gives a new form of operation and structure, namely the organic, but it also allows and also forces philosophy to identify a new condition for itself. In other words, philosophy had to become organic if you want to exist. And this is why we see in the post-Kantians that we cannot discuss today. For example, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, the three major idealists, both the mechanism of reflection and the concept of organic are central to their philosophical project. We will not be able to address Schelling and Hegel's organicism, which I deal with in my book, because of lack of time. But I hope this clarifies our first claim that the organic was, towards the end of the 18th century, a new condition of philosophizing since Kant's critique of judgment. But what is the status of the organic or organicism today? We know that organicism as a philosophical thought informed by embryology was developed in the 20th century by various philosophers, notably Alfred North Whitehead, as well as biologists who identified themselves with him. For example, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, Joseph Wuttger, but most importantly, and for me most interestingly, Joseph Neher, who became a sinologist, and he is the person who named Chinese philosophy and organismic philosophy. But because he was already a representative of organicism before he became a sinologist. But this is something we can discuss in during the discussion. Indeed, we may be able to associate different schools under this condition of philosophizing: organicism, embryology, systems theory, Gödel's recursive function, Turing machine, and cybernetics. So this is the paradigm that we observe in the first half of the 20th century under the name organicism. And organicism wants to go beyond both mechanism and vitalism. It was a remedy to the catastrophe produced by industrialism in the 19th century. As Ludwig von Bertalanffy writes in his general system theory, I quote, "The mechanical world view, taking the play of physical particles as ultimate reality, found its expression in a civilization which glorifies physical technology that has led eventually to the catastrophes of our time. Possibly the model of the world as a great organization can help to reinforce the sense of reverence for the living, which we have almost lost in the last centenary decades of human history." It was a book published in 1936. In the 18th century, the opposition between... Oh, sorry. Sorry. No, it's good. I give you some time to read it. In the 18th century, the operation between organism and mechanism remained conceptual. In the 19th century, the triumph of mechanism in the progress and also in the process of industrialization amplifies this tension. So we see that in the first half of the 20th century, there was such a strong voice about organicism as an antidote or as a remedy of industrialism. However, we ask, is still the case today? Does organism necessarily stand against mechanism as it was the case in the 18th century? And in view of the triumph of industrial technologies, many critics want to oppose technological development with organism of one form or another, as if the organic is the safe backyard, and as if the technology that we are talking about today is still the 18th century mechanism. This kind of critique, based on the opposition between organism and mechanism, often leads to a fantasy towards a political naturalism, which sees the organic as the ideal model for art, philosophy, and politics, which was the case for the 18th century Romantics. But it seems to me that in order to give room to philosophy, to thinking today, we must re-examine this opposition in order to understand what would be the new condition of philosophizing today. And let's ponder upon the verdict of Heidegger in the notorious Notebook. It might very well still take a considerable time to recognize that the organism and the organic present themselves as the mechanistic technological triumph of modernity over the domain of growth nature. What Heidegger says here has to be thought against the backdrop of the mechanism and organism debate of the 18th century and also the 19th century. Heidegger wants to point out that this opposition between the mechanical and the organic was already obsolete. And therefore, the organic is no longer an ideal of the humanity and perpetual peace. What made Heidegger come to this conclusion, and what does it mean for us today? Now, we must go back to what we said at the beginning of this talk, the first slide that I showed. Heidegger's claim that cybernetics means both end and completion of Western philosophy and metaphysics. Instead of simply understanding as a claim of his geopolitical and philosophical quest for the question of being, we now have to align it with our questioning concerning a new condition of philosophizing. In order to understand this claim, we must look into cybernetics itself, especially Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics, Control and Communication in Man and Animal, published in 1948. But before going into this, there is a chronological fact worth paying attention to. This quote from Heidegger in the Black Notebook was written in the 1930s, while Wiener's work only came out 10 years later. And Heidegger later on had read Wiener carefully when it was translated into German. Heidegger himself has also commented almost on every page of the German Hegelian and Cybernetician Gerhard Günther's book, The Consciousness of Machine, A Metaphysics of Cybernetics, which clearly demonstrates that cybernetics is the realization of the Hegelian reflective logic. Here I would like to refer to the first chapter of Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics. It was titled Newtonian and Bergsonian Time. Newtonian time is a mechanist and time symmetric, therefore reversible. Bergsonian time is biological, creative, and irreversible. It is not until the second law of thermodynamics proposed by the French physicist Sadi Carnot in 1924, almost a century after Newton's death in 1727, that we recognize the error of time, and that the entropy of the system increases with time is irreversible. Already in his first book, Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, 1889, I think it's translated into English with a very strange title, which I don't remember, Besson launches a fierce attack on the way how time is conceptualized in Western science and philosophy. Time is understood in terms of space, for example, intervals which can be represented in space. Therefore, the time that was thus conceptualized is timeless. It is homogeneous, like the intervals marked on the clock. Instead, time, suggests Bergson, cannot be fully understood as extensions ordered in spatial terms. It contains heterogeneity or qualitative multiplicity in organic forms. Time is force, which is singular in every instant. Like the Heraclitean river, it doesn't repeat itself twice, like a mechanical clock. Indeed, mechanical or linear causality doesn't exist in duration. Bergsonian time provides a new way to understand human consciousness and experience. But it was the beginning of the 20th century. These differences between the Newtonian time and Bergsonian time define the boundary between physics and biology, machine and organism. The task of cybernetics was to show that with the advancements in physics, especially statistical mechanics and quantum mechanics, it is possible to employ notions such as feedback and information to construct a cybernetic machine which breaks this boundary between organism and machine. Though towards the end of the chapter, Wiener claims that, I quote, as you can see from this slide, the modern automation existed in the same sort of Bergsonian time as the living organism, and here there is no reason in Bergson's consideration why the essential mode of functioning of the living organism should not be the same as that of the automation of this type. In fact, the whole mechanist vitalist controversy has been relegated to the limbo of badly posed questions. Now I think the first chapter of Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics is the most important passage, the most important part of his work. In Wiener's conceptualization, when we grasp, for example, a glass of water and bring it towards my mouth, it involves multiple feedback loops and adjustments according to the information evaluated, which in turn measures the level of organization. Feedback simply means that the difference between the output and the expected output is fed back to the system in order to improve the operation. For example, when I reach out to this glass of water, there were multiple feedback loops taking place among my muscles, motors, and perception, and this feedback allows us to adjust our position, my positions and gestures. It also occurred in technical objects, like the example given by the collaborator of Wiener, Rosenbrot, that the torpedoes possess a target-seeking mechanism by following the magnetic pull of the hull of the ship, when they have to shoot a ship, or the submarine, or the sound of the propeller. The concept of feedback is rather simple. However, it opens a new way to conceptualize a non-mechanistic machine. Or in other words, Wiener is claiming that a Bergsonian machine is realizable. Feedback here means reflection. A circularity between a being and its environment, a nonlinear movement of self-adjustments towards a purpose or telos that defines the whole. This association between feedback and reflection, a word which we related to Kant earlier, is not simply analogical, but rather, as Gilbert Simondon, a French philosopher, a very important but not well-known thinker still, has already remarked in an article titled Cybernetics and Epistemology, written in the 1960s, that only in the Critique of Judgment was Immanuel Kant able to deal with cybernetics. It is unlike a Cartesian causal chain, which we can visualize as a linear propagation from one proposition to another. Wiener refers to the first feedback system as James Watt Gardner of the steam engine, which is able to regulate its velocity according to different conditions of the road during its operation. A more contemporary example, contemporary in the sense of Wiener's time, is homeostasis, a concept described by the physiologist, the French physiologist Claude Bernard, and later coined by Walter Cannon. Bernard, in his 1965 Introduction to the Studies of Experimental Medicine, writes that, I quote, "All the vital mechanisms, however varied they may be, have only one object, that of preserving constant the conditions of life in the internal environment." End of quote. Homeostasis is a mechanism that is able to keep the system within a certain range of constants, for example, temperature, the amount of potassium in the blood, in the body liquid, and so on, so forth. Homeostasis was also used by the British cybernetician Ashby to characterize life. Feedback here replaces reflection of the monad and prompts Wiener to reject notions such as life, vitalism, and soul, as he says, I quote, "It is my thesis that the physical functioning of the living individual and the operation of some of the newer communication machines are precisely parallel in their analogous attempts to control entropy through feedback." End of quote. This analogy between the cybernetic machine and organism leads Wiener to associate both organism and machine by a common telos, the resistance against, I quote, "the general tendency for the increase of entropy." I cannot explain more here, but this of course has to do with the work of Schrödinger's What is Life? For Wiener, the concept of feedback is not limited to technical objects and organisms. He also extends it to analysis in economy and other social phenomena. For example, commenting on what he calls long-time feedback, he gave the example of Chinese idolatry, according to which the mandate of heaven is correlated to the destiny of the emperor and the dynasty. The suffering of the people due to wars and famines is an indicator that the emperor or the dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven, and therefore that is destined to fall. Wiener emphasized this way of governance, the kind of moral philosophy or moral economy of governments in China as a feedback system. With Wiener's formulation, one can see feedback everywhere. It constitutes a new epistemology. As Heidegger claims that it might very well still take a considerable time to recognize that organism and organic present themselves as a mechanistic technological triumph of modernity, the verdict of Heidegger remains to be rethought carefully. However, shouldn't we already see a parallel between this mechanical technological triumph of the organic and the end of philosophy as such an accomplishment? And by seeing in this way, can we not understand more concretely what Heidegger proposed to take thinking beyond philosophy? It is not simply an announcement of the end of philosophy, but rather a new condition of philosophizing here that has to be that has to be identified here. In the 18th century, it was based on the recognition that the organic condition of philosophizing that has started as a counterpart of mechanism and which symbolizes humanity and history. After cybernetics and its continuation in artificial intelligence and machine learning, biotechnology today, it has already come to its end. The end of philosophy announced by Heidegger doesn't mean that no one will do philosophy anymore, of course, because we are still practicing this discipline. It is more similar to what Hegel announced about the end of art in his lectures on aesthetics. But Heidegger goes further that philosophy is no longer the highest expression of the life of the spirit, because such role is taken by cybernetics. Heidegger wants to look for other thinking beyond those we already said and determined in the Western philosophical tradition. After the organic, what is yet to begin? After the organic does not mean that we wanted to renounce the concept of the organic in its totality. In the contrary, we would like to identify its position today in order to inquire into the condition, this new condition of philosophizing. And I would like to summarize my argument in 3 points. Firstly, the digital recursive machine that we live with today are fundamentally different from the analog, from the mechanistic machine that we associate with the 17th and 18th century, let alone synthetic biology and nanotechnology. On the contrary, we are living among recursive machines. We are becoming more and more organic. In other words, they are like what Simondon describes as becoming organic or becoming natural object. Secondly, the organic thinking associated with assimilated by systems theory, for example, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, Nicholas Luhmann, Heinz von Foerster, and others, is no longer a conceptual tool of analysis, but rather a technical reality, technological reality, meaning that they are realized in material terms and therefore become tools of social control. The performativity that Luhmann identifies as operation of the system could be measured with all kinds of sensors and devices today, and of course also algorithms. Thirdly, these machines are forming gigantic organisms in planetary scale. They realize what the Jesuit Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and this is a very interesting figure, I hope that we have time to discuss him a little bit. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a paleontologist who participated in the discovery of the Peking man in the early 20th century in China. And what we had, the realization of gigantic organism in planetary scale is also a realization of what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin calls the noosphere. A noosphere, nous, refer to the Greek word of nous, of thinking, of noiesis. Teilhard claims that with the realization of the noosphere, we will be able to arrive at the superbrain, which is the brain of our brain. This superbrain is nothing fundamentally different from what we called superintelligence in the 1990s, or the Homo Deus, which you just mentioned today. Geopolitics is characterized by the competition towards such a superintelligence, or what is known as technological singularity. So we are again in a kind of self-defeat, as you said, and a pessimistic apocalypse. After the organic is a quest in the new condition of philosophizing today. Again, when I say condition, it doesn't mean a specific idea or thought, but rather that which thinking has to respond out of its own necessity. If since the 18th century thinking has to become organic today, however, it is no longer enough to think along this line, but rather one will have to think first of all think such organicity together with machines, but also beyond this organicity. To go beyond is to see its limit. Therefore, today it is for me, I think it would be ironic to separate how digital technology simulates organic life. But rather we must push beyond this opposition, or we must go beyond this opposition between organic and mechanic, which still presents itself as a dominant form of criticism against technology that we still find in some contemporary thinkers, or in its opposite, a naive defense for machines. The task of thinking cannot escape machines, but rather it should orient itself towards machines, meaning to orient, we think, the danger. And we just talked about this before the talk, the question of danger. Like what Heidegger says while commenting on the poetry of Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, I quote, "It may be that any other salvation than that which comes from where the danger is still within the unholy or the catastrophe." At the same time, we must think beyond the totalizing power of the organic, which Heidegger calls enfremming, the Gestell, the essence of modern technology. It means that we have to see the limit of the organic as well as the limit of our aspiration for the organic as a solution to all the problems. In the 20th century, philosophers such as Alfred North Whitehead, Louis Montfort, sociologists like George Freeman in France, among many others, aspire to the organic as a remedy to mechanism and industrialism of the 19th century, to what Marx describes as alienation. It was because machines and tools were understood as the organized inorganic, means that they could be reintegrated through and in the body. However, today machines ceases to be organized inorganic. They are becoming gigantic systems. For example, Google, for example, the Chinese social credit systems, which are called organizing inorganic. And to think beyond the organic is also to break away from the tendency of systemic totalization intrinsic in the concept of the organic, because you cannot talk about the organic without touching the question of totalization, which Gilles Deleuze describes as societies of control, or what François Lyotard calls the postmodern society in the 1970s. The society of control are nothing more than gigantic cybernetic machines based on self-organization and optimization. Therefore, after the organic is an invitation to resituate cybernetics in the history of philosophy and the history of technology in order to reflect on our current condition and the dominant ideology behind it. Now, I don't want to pretend that I have an answer to this. On my part, I attempt to respond in the last chapter of my book, Recursivity and Contingency, by elaborating on what I call fragmentation. To fragment means to disintegrate, to decompose. And it is in the contrary to what is called common, to what is called growth, to our organism. To what extent can fragmentation be a response? Now, I can briefly introduce the concept as a way to liberate future from the dominant transhumanist ideology, which pivots both its politics and business on the idea of the technological singularity. For technology, it means to break away from a dominant universalizing epistemology which determines our imagination of scientific and technological development. Now here I would like to refer this graph. This graph basically says something very simple, is that in the process of modernization, different historical time or time of different civilizations are synchronized on the same time axis through technologies. And now you can see that all the different historical time converge on the same time axis, and they are moving towards one point called technological singularity or homogeneous or intelligence explosion. This is the vision of the future that's told by by the transhumanists, who believe or who also propose in that there is no longer any distinction between the between mechanism and organism. We can realize any organic, or we can intervene into any organic body with our digital recursive machines. The organic constitutes today a triumph of scientific method, while paradoxically a political naturalism based on the opposition between organic and mechanic remains no longer effective. Instead of rejecting science and technology by going back to indigenous ontologies, we should propose a new agenda. That's my proposal. It is not because indigenous thinking is obsolete, like what was presented in the modern, non-modern dichotomy, but rather because indigenous knowledge can only exhibit or attain its full force and possibility when it is able to confront and transform modern technology instead of just opposing to it. And it is on this point that I have been trying to engage with the work of Professor Eduardo Viveros de Castro, and I'm really happy that he's here today. Instead of taking the path of multiple naturalism, I suggest to develop further what I call techno-diversity, or a multiplicity of cosmotechnics, in order to fragment the system of knowledge and to reopen the question of technology and its future. In my previous book, The Question Concerning Technology in China, and let's say in cosmotechnics. So this is the idea of fragmentation that I propose, is that how can we instead of going or converging towards the technological singularity, which is the end point, which is an apocalypse, how can we reopen the question again? Reopen the question of future again, through reopen the question of technology. And for this, we have to recognize the technological condition and the condition of philosophizing today. For politics, the aspiration for an organic geopolitics, since Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, 1795, appeared to be already obsolete. As I tried to explain before, that the organic was central to Kant's political philosophy. And in the Perpetual Peace, he mentioned something. He proposed a model which is very interesting, for I think you will think about this today. He says that, imagine if the international relations is like an organic body. He says that the Chinese, there were two nations, two countries or two cultures, he said, were really sage. One is China, because China isolated itself from the rest of the world. And the Japanese only opened its door to the Dutch. Not because they know that the colonizers have very bad behavior. And Kant's argument is basically that, if we consider international politics as an organism, and one part, which means if one country is behaving badly, then there will be a feedback, there will be a response from other countries, and this will force the country with bad behavior to change its attitude and change its behavior. That is how the idea of the organic play in the concept of the idea of the perpetual peace. But of course, we know that after not long ago, after Kant's 1794 perpetual peace, the isolated China was conquered by the British army, and then have to open the port, and it was the same with Japan. Well, the development of geopolitics seems today to be dominated by the vision and desire for technological singularity. As we know, that if you see from here, this convergence, In August 2017, China released a white paper to become the leading country of AI before 2030. 1 month after, which is the 1st of September, Putin said to the Russian children that whoever leads in AI will dominate the world. And afterward, you can see many white papers from different countries about AI development. So, for example, in Germany, if you listen to the radio every day, if you listen to the radio, you can hear almost every day saying that how fast China is with AI and how behind Germany is. But we can see that this is how that all the nation states or all the countries are competing for the credit of artificial intelligence, converging towards a singularity and apocalypse. A new geopolitics has yet to emerge. While for such a new geopolitics to be possible, it is necessary to develop what I call the techno-diversity. And I hope that I have time to explain maybe during the discussion, which doesn't lead us to a unified and homogeneous view of humanity and technology, but rather allow thinking to emerge after the end of European philosophy, thus announced by Heidegger more than half a century ago. So I hope that this talk was able to open certain questions and also for discussions. But there are so many points that was mentioned but still has to be elaborated. I hope that maybe during the discussion we have time to do so. So I think I finished here, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Roy, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted with your ideas. And you left us with the impression that exactly when you were talking about the techno-diversity, we wanted to hear more, but I like that you stopped just there. So it leaves it open for imagination and for everyone to participate. I would like to open the floor for questions, if you don't mind. We might take a few questions from the audience. And I would love to hear from Eduardo too, if you can and you would like, because you were mentioning Professor Roy's work many points and also mentioned in the lecture. So if you don't mind, I would love to hear from you first. Okay?
I wasn't expecting that, so.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think it was appropriate.
Well, anyway, I still have to ruminate upon what you've just gave us as food for thought. So, just two or three things that occur to me, especially concerning these two last figures, the convergence, the Homo Deus figure, and the other one. Yes, the one who there is a universal convergence, and the other one, which there is still a convergence, and then it says the singularity could breed plurality. That's your idea. That's an alternative way of conceiving what's waiting for us. Either as the singularity people, the singularitarians hold that there's going to be a universal convergence towards a single general universal intelligence, or a kind of explosion of diversity. But first, this explosion of diversity will still go through a sort of what to call this bottleneck of singularity, meaning there's going to be necessarily a convergence, a universal synchronization as a precondition for this explosion of these multi-techniques, multi-technological imaginations, or the cosmotechnics of plurality. So the question would be, there's still a bottleneck ahead of us. Second, last question. Of what exactly this diversity consists, meaning what characterizes this diversity? In which sense these different cosmotechnics will be different, given that they will all have to, let's say, start from this new image of thought, or this new image of being, actually, which is the cybernetic object, the cybernetic entity. So, where does diversity lie in this image? This will be the two questions.
So thank you very, very much for these two questions, and I think it is also allowed me to clarify some points that I touched upon, but I couldn't elaborate due to the lack of time and the complexity of the arguments. So the first question is that, well, in fact, I don't believe that singularity will lead to plurality. This would be the argument from the singularity people. So for those who are not familiar with the idea of singularity, it means basically that they call it singularity is the moment when the machine intelligence is able to reflect on itself, like having consciousness, and this is associated with the idea of intelligence explosion. There's a lot of intelligence, and this may lead to the possibility of a superintelligence. And the superintelligence is able to replace everything. Everyone, like a philosopher, a university teacher, journalist, everything, and also the government, because the superintelligence is able to do better economical, social and political planning than any human beings, because human beings, for them, is the source of mistakes. Politics means precisely, for the transhumanist, humanist epistemology. So that is why, during my talk I said that the politics of transhumanism is a pivot on the politics and the business as well, because for them politics and business are the same thing, a pivot on the technological singularity. But what will happen after singularity? Actually, no one knows what will happen after technological singularity. And either the technological singularity will be realized or not, this is still a question. But the problem is the discourse around the discourse and ideology around technological singularity, which poses me a huge problem. And even if we say that one day we may arrive in technological singularity, and that a system, say an organic system, can only survive when it has diversity. This is the argument that, if we realize at that point that we have diversity, then this diversity is still within the limit of the system. There is not really a radical diversity, there are diversity within the system. So it's not my argument that by realizing technological singularity, we will then have a diversity. No, for me, it's precisely the opposite, is that we must go beyond. We have to think beyond the technological singularity. Therefore, also to think beyond cybernetics. But how can we think beyond cybernetics? As a general or as a universal logic, which claims that it has already overcome dualism. Because cybernetics is precisely a logic that claims that it has already transcended dualism. But while criticism today, or critique of technology today, is still based on a dualism. In many cases, nature, technology, society, technology, and so on. But cybernetics is already claimed that, I transcend, we have overcome dualism. But cybernetics is not a solution, not yet a solution, but we must go beyond cybernetics. How? But the question is how? Which is your second question. What is diversity, and what this diversity look like? You know? So I think for me, when I talk about diversity, it is also the question of locality. Here we have a locality of Brazil, and in my work I will have a locality which is China. What does it mean by locality and what is the relation between locality and technology, which is has been conceived to be universal logic. And in my previous book, the question concerning technology in China and let's say in cosmotechnics, I try to argue or try to suggest that it is necessary for us today to break from this idea of this understanding of technology as universal. But of course, first of all, we have to problematize the question of the notion of the universal. Because in different disciplines, so for example, in history of technology, when we study when we do comparison, for example, let's say, paper making in the 2nd century in China was more advanced in Europe. Metallurgy in the 14th century in Europe was more advanced in China. The comparative studies kind of affirm that we are talking about the same kind of technologies, but only one is more advanced than the other. But this was precisely the arguments of Joseph Needham in his work Science and Civilization in China. The author that I mentioned before, who was first of all a biochemist, an organicist, and then he became a sinologist and written and edited 26 volumes of Science and Civilization in China. And Needham raised this very important question, and this question has puzzled and haunted several generations of Chinese intellectuals. Why didn't modern science and technology appear in China and India, not only in Europe? Historians followed Joseph Needham will try to defend this idea, this question, by saying that, well, look, before the 16th century, there were many things more advanced in China than they are than Europe. So this is comparison, which technology is more advanced in which region. A regional comparison of technological development. But it is very much based on the conception of a singular time axis which indicates progress and advancements of technology. But this is exactly not what Joseph Needham wanted to say. Joseph Needham's points, which was very clear in the first and second volume of Science and Civilization in China, is that actually it doesn't make sense. It's not appropriate to compare these technologies in China and in Europe as if they are the same, because they are different. There are different thinkings. There are different cosmologies behind these technologies. You cannot just see its product. You cannot just compare its product. You need to understand that there is complexity. There are different technological thought and cosmologies behind this technology. So that's his point. And that this is also an entry point to what I call multiple cosmotechnics. They like what you have been doing to show that there is multiple natures. My question was that could we also think, or could we also try to understand there have been multiple techniques? And because it seems to me that this question was kind of shadowed or obscured in the 20th century, maybe also in anthropology. I must say that I'm no anthropologist, so maybe you can correct me. For example, in what is called the anthropology of technology, let's say André Leroi-Gourhan, the technology has been understood as the externalization of memory and liberation of organs, which is, we can say that it exists almost in all cultures, in all civilizations. Therefore, technology is universal. But on the other hand, there is very little discussion on the question of cosmology in the work of Levallois-Perron. And that is why in my previous book, I tried to show that actually cosmology has a very important, has a very important role in the invention and use of technology, which cannot be ignored. And that is how I developed the concept of cosmotechnics instead of techniques. Now the third obstacle is that, for example, in philosophy of technology, like for example, Heidegger's 1949 essay of the conference, The Question Concerning Technology, which was accepted by many scholars, even in China, in Japan, and so on. And in this famous article, Heidegger trying to say that there are two essences of techniques, two essences of technology. One is the Greek techne. The other is modern technology. The essence of Greek techne is a poiesis, is a bringing forth, so on. And the essence of modern technology is Gestalt and framing, that every being is understood as a standing reserve or as resources. Now, if we accept Heidegger's thesis, we still have a huge problem. How can we articulate a Chinese technology, Amazonian technology, Japanese technology? Can we reduce them to Greek techne? I don't believe so. But if not, how can we articulate them? Then there is the question of technodiversity in our issue that we still have to investigate. So my work on China was trying to use China as an example to show that in fact there is a long history of technological thought in this technology, and the question is that how can we make sense of this technological thought today? Will this technological thought that I constructed be able to give us some insight, for insights in terms of, for example, imagination of the future of technology, some insights into the transformation of this technology that we are in the process of inventing and developing. And will be possible to, instead of converging toward the technological singularity, which is determined by efficiency, by acceleration, that allow us to reopen the question of technology, that we see the divergence and as well as a reopening of what we call world history, that was kind of understood especially since the time of Hegel, as a singular progress towards the absolute, which is also the homo deus. So that is what my response to the brief answer to the second question, how to go back to the question of locality. And we were discussing about this the other day, that how can we think locality beyond localism? How can we think locality beyond an identity politics? And I think technology here can become a medium for us to think beyond this, because technology is also vulnerable to mutation. Technology mutates, it absorbs other things. And so therefore a technodiversity could be an alternative to identity politics today. Yeah. So that was my brief response.
This is really great. I see a lot of hands, so let's give the opportunity. Yeah, let's take 3. And please make the questions short. And just to remind you, the definition of a question is something that ends with a question mark, and your voice generally goes up, like,
Thank you, Professor. That was a great talk, and I really loved your last book. I would just like to make a quick question. What do you think would be the main difference between Simondon's general arithmetics and your own general organology? Do you think that Simondon's view is maybe not mindful of historical contingency, as you try to be when you gave your example of China? Do you think the description of concretization is a bit univocal, as if it was just one single process of technicity? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very technical question. This question is very technical, so I will try to generalize it, and then because for those who don't understand, who didn't read Simondon, also understand what what the question is about. Well, for me, it is French philosopher Gilbert Simondon, someone who is not remain very unknown today. He has a very important book called On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, which is trying to explain to the evolution of technology, the evolution of technical objects. And in this book, there is a third part. This third part is very strange. Why? Because in the previous two parts, he was talking about the concretization, development of technology, and there's an evolution that how the technical object become more and more complex and concrete. And in the third part, he opened this question. He opened this third part by saying that it is not sufficient to understand technicity by just looking at the evolution of technical objects themselves. He said if we want to understand technicity, we must understand the genesis of technicity. We must understand the relation between technological thought and other thought, aesthetic thinking, philosophical thought. So that means that we should not, for me it says that we should avoid a technological determinism. We should not only see everything from the perspective of the technological progress, but also engage or try to understand technology and its relation to other thought. And what he tried to show is what he called the genesis of technicity is a way to understand what's the relation between technological thought and religious thought and philosophical thought and aesthetic thought. And here we can see that he wants to situate technology in a broader reality, which I call a cosmic reality. So he was talking about how technology evolved from the magic phase. I think it's from the work of James Frazer, that technology, how the magic phase bifurcated into the religion, technology, and each of them bifurcated into theory and practice process. But I don't want to enter into details, but what I want to say is that the important thing that he said is that we must situate technology in a much broader reality. What does it mean by that a broader reality? That's also a cosmic reality. So for me, Simondon provides a general idea to inquire into the question of what I call cosmotechnics, the relation between cosmology, philosophy, and technology. But we still need to contextualize his idea of genesis of technicity, meaning to localize technology, meaning to understand what I call locality and technology. So, for example, my work on China was an example to show that how technology in China was situated within a cosmic reality which is closely related to Chinese thought. So let me give an example of Chinese medicine. If you look at Chinese medicine today, basically they use the same set of vocabularies as Chinese cosmology. You know, qi, yin yang, 5 phrases. But if you ask a Chinese medical doctor, show me qi, can you show it to me? Can you demonstrate to me what it is? It's not possible. It's not possible. And if you ask him to show what is yin yang in the body, they cannot show it to you. I have a Chinese doctor who is a professor of Chinese medicine in the University of Hong Kong, and I consult him, and he said to me, you know, if you ask me to show it to you, I cannot. But can you say that? But Chinese medicine is also not wrong, because it's empirical science exists since 1,000 years. But this is an example to show that what I try to work along the line of Simondon is precisely to show how to concretely understand this strange part, the third part of Simondon's work. And if Simondon's idea remains, you know, a very, we can say, Eurocentric is a very heavy term, but very kind of from the perspective of the Occident, then we have to concretely understand this in terms of what I call techno-diversity. And for that we need to look into a long history. So that is what I try to do with Simondon, but also to further Simondon's work.
Very good. I think we have time for two more.
Yep. I guess I'm just trying to follow through the implications of what you said, and maybe in ways that you haven't come around to yet. But so it's basically two questions that follow from your answer to Eduardo's question. The first one is, you said you would contest the ideology surrounding the singularity, that singularity could lead to plurality. Am I correct in inferring that that means you actually think it necessarily wouldn't, it would necessarily lead to the opposite? And in that case, isn't the singularity the limit of plurality itself? I.e., should one be a pluralist in relation to everything except the singularity? The other thing is, in those two graphs, there's those two graphs with the convergence and the divergence patterns. They're actually graphs to two different things at the same time. A graph of the res gestae and the storia rerum gestarum. On the one hand, you have a tendency for, which you exemplified with Hegel's idea of universal history, to reduce human history to a single thing, to a single narrative. But on the other hand, what produces that is the synchronization of human history around a single time axis, which is produced by the creation of a global market, etc., by the expansion of capitalism. So I guess the question here is, what kind of politics would, because obviously it wouldn't be enough. In a sense, the plurality that you ask for already exists. It's already there. It's not only not recognized because we fail to see it, because we live under the empire of Hegelian universal history, but also because the material conditions that created Hegelian universal history continue to exist. So what kind of politics could ensure on a material level the pluralism that you ask for?
Can I answer? Okay, so thank you very much for this question. I think that these two questions points to the same direction. I mean, the question of singularity and the question of the post-Hegelian politics. For me, I think the question, this ideology, we call it, this ideology of singularity, basically for me is eschatology. It is eschatology means that, well, of course, we don't know what will happen after the singularity, but let's just go there first. But as I said before, that whether we can really go there or not is one question. But the other question is that the discourse, this idea, this projection, or this articulation of the future, or what is to come, is very problematic in itself. So, for example, I was asking last year I was asking my students, what do you think about your future? Thinking about singularity and artificial intelligence. It was in Germany. It was when I was still teaching in Leuphana in Lüneburg. And I was really surprised that 80% of my students felt miserable, because they saw that we are all going to the end. So this is singularity for me. First of all, it's an eschatology. Secondly, even if we say, I repeat what I said before, even if it can be realized, and even if it affirms that plurality is the best condition for itself, it is still a plurality limit in the system, in a certain system. So how can we think of a radical plurality which is not confined to a system, like an organic, organism, even though it has a plurality, but it's a very limited plurality. So that is the necessity to move beyond. Singularity is also to reopen the question of politics that you said, what Hegel called universal history. But Hegel's universal history, as you say, as you remember when he says that the absolute is, or the direction to which the universal history is moving towards, is precisely what Leibniz called theodicy, which is also, of course, the homo deus, the realization of the kingdom of God. So again, an eschatology in that sense. But today, but there was one point that you mentioned. You said that the plurality already exists. But I wonder, what does it mean that the plurality exists? As I try to show that we have to re-articulate multiple cosmotechnics or different technological thought or technodiversity. But this seems to me only the first step to reopen the question of politics today, because we all know, and then especially for countries such as Brazil or China and so on, we all have experienced this process called modernization. And modernization is very clearly isn't that in the modernization we see the incompatibility between the diversity that already exists and modern science and technology. There was a diversity, but there is also incompatibility. And this incompatibility, we have two attitudes towards the incompatibility. One is to subsume one to the other. Like, for example, there has been a debate since a long time. There's a debate about Chinese medicine and Western medicine. If Chinese medicine should subordinate to Western medicine and use Chinese Western method to explain Chinese medicine, like to subsume its epistemology to epistemology of Western medicine. Or there is another possibility, is to allow a new thinking to emerge out of this incompatibility. But reply to the previous question, this is also the condition of what Simondon called individuation. The new thinking only come out of this incompatibility. And now I think that we still have to confront this question of incompatibility. Only by confronting this incompatibility and allow new thinking to come out can we address the question of a new geopolitics. I think Henry Kissinger has a very good point on this. I mean, I don't think that he was conscious of that, but he has an article called How the Enlightenment Ends, which was published last June in The Atlantic. His argument is very simple but very interesting. He says that the Enlightenment uses its technology to promote its philosophy, the process of modernization after the Enlightenment. And he says that, but now the Enlightenment, the age of reason, comes to its end, because we have machines that are better at reasoning than human beings. So we need a new philosophy for the technology that we have now. Now before, it was in the service of the Enlightenment. It promoted the Enlightenment idea. But now we need a new philosophy to address this new technology, new technologies. So for me, it is what Kissinger described, that how technology promotes the Enlightenment is new technology to promote its philosophy. Is for me is this process of modernization, of convergence. And now we need a philosophy is to reopen. After this phase comes to its end, historically. And my response, I don't want to pretend that I have a really answer to that, but my response will be what I called fermentation before. And how can fermentation for me here means precisely a technodiversity to emerge, to allow it to appear, to emerge. And then we see that we are not moving towards the Homo Deus, we are not moving towards the apocalyptic future, but rather a reopening of future. But this is the biggest challenge that we have now. Because how can, if you ask China, you have to think of another way of doing technology and don't compete with the USA. Or you ask Russia, don't develop a blockchain, develop other kind of technology. Then there is a question of competition. And then we will say, the most dogmatic response, we will say that no, there is no other space. There is no space to manipulate. There is no space for technodiversity because we all have to compete. But this is all the paradox that we have. And I think that we still have to that it is important to understand the technological condition that we have now, and also see the contradiction that's still, or the incompatibility that we still confront today, and have the courage to move forward with some radical openings. And I think that this is what we can do, what thinking can do, what we in the social work in the human sciences have to do, and also have to work with engineers to, for example, what you are doing. How can we develop alternative technologies? How can we develop alternative or new philosophy of technologies, but not simply to say that there is a necessity to compete and we have to go forward, and then we are all moving towards the end. This would be the concrete political action that we can have.
Última pergunta, pode fazer em português ou em inglês, à vontade também. Vamos lá.
I'd like to ask you actually about the issue of the Kantian ontology on how to know life itself and how to solve this, be it with cybernetics or with any other theory. And I myself, I read a lot of McLuhan, that it seems that nobody reads it anymore, or I don't know if you like it or not. But it seems to me that he solves very well this issue with technology and ontology, with the idea that's a Mumford's idea of extensions of our bodies. And also in my readings of technology, I think that he was was the author that most valued Chinese philosophy and cosmology in his writings. So I'm always, because I also study China, I work with the Chinese Academy of Science. So I was just like, I'm working on my thesis, I'm starting to work on my thesis, and I really would like to use him as a, like as a core philosopher to discuss technology. But I'm always bumping in nowhere, quoting him or talking about him, and your research somewhere, like brought me this idea. I don't know if you don't like him or...
Vamos pegar a última aqui, por favor.
Faz três e faz pequenininho.
Tá.
So I'll state my question real quick. I think it has to do to diversity, and in my view, there are two possible ways of looking at diversity. Of course, there's a diversity in plurality, and there's a diversity in multiplicity, which, to use a more Deleuzian term. And I think one of the issues we face today is that the way AI works, machine learning specifically, it performs a radical fragmentation that we perceive as this plurality, as this possibility of plurality, but which is precisely what you mean by plurality contained by the system. So how, when we are faced with what Galloway states really clearly as a centralized infrastructure, or we have the centralization of protocols, which we cannot really escape. How can we produce political resistance through a diversity of multiplicity in order to resist this movement that you present in your diagrams?
Hello. I have a question concerning your article for the magazine eFlux, What Begins After the End of Enlightenment. And I work at ITS, and we are very concerned about climate change issues right now. We are especially concerned about running researches against fake news and other kinds of stuff. We are facing a wave of fake news concerning the climate change denial. You say that the unhappy consciousness of fascism and xenophobia arises from the inability to orient in the technological world. I think that's a great explanation of what's happening right now, and this very irrational response to what we would concern scientific issues. And I understand that through your point of view of diversity is that instead of coming to an agreement about this issue, we should look at how different cultures deal with what we call multinaturalism, and with the relation between humans and things that are not human, right? They're just alive. But at the same time, I feel like your words talk about the end of enlightenment and the end of the Anthropocene in a very philosophical way. I think we cannot deny that we are coming to the end of the Anthropocene biologically as well. I mean, we are seeing our forests being burned to the ground and other things. Okay, we understand that Heidegger has a point of view that is very about machine learning and artificial intelligence, but how do we deal with things that are very alive in our current day? We're seeing the Anthropocene literally fall apart. How do you suggest we deal with that? Thank you.
Let's abuse of Professor Roy, because I want to take the question from that person over there, please.
Oi, meu nome é Cláudia. Eu queria te agradecer pela palestra, porque me instigou a ler o seu livro, o seu trabalho. Porque eu estou afastada, eu sou psicanalista e intérprete também, mas estou afastada há muito tempo e desde que eu queria fazer a pergunta, já vieram muitas outras na minha cabeça. Mas enfim, o que tinha me ocorrido inicialmente é que, por exemplo, pensando em Marx, que considera o valor do trabalho, né, em relação ao tempo gasto, então me veio a questão do tempo na cabeça, né? Assim, como é que a gente poderia pensar no Cronos, que você voltou lá nos gregos, né, em Heráclito, e no Kairos, né, que é um outro tempo, né, que é o tempo do sensível, é o tempo do afeto. E não sei se tem alguma coisa a ver, mas eu me senti instada a perguntar sobre isso, e as outras perguntas ficam para depois, e que eu, inclusive, me informar melhor. Tá bom? Obrigada.
Ask for clarification, so you wanted to ask about the time, the Chronos and the Kairos.
Yes, that's right.
What do I think about that?
Yes, and the affectivity of time as well.
What is a huge question. But should we start with the first question? So we have 4 questions. I don't know if I understand the second question clearly, but let's start with the first one. Is Masha McLuhan, but that helped me to clarify what I call the organized inorganic and organizing inorganic. I think in the 20th century, when we talk about technology, we are still talking about organized inorganic. Meaning that a tour in anthropology, for example, a tour for André Le Vargeron is an externalization, but it is also a interiorization of the tour through the body. It is organized. It's an invention. It's already organized. Inorganic is an inorganic matter that is organized in the way that could be interiorized by the body. That is the tours that we have. And you can say this very general idea of extension of the body, of the nerve system, and so on. And this is, I think, this is these are many contributions by even Derrida's supplement. Stigler's tertiary retention. So these are the prosthesis or prosthetic theory of technology in the 20th century. But this is still very based on, I think that's still based on the idea on that the human body is capable of reintegrate. The human body is able to reintegrate these tools and these technologies. This is true in the case in many analyses. So, for example, the name I mentioned before, the French sociologist, Georges Freeman. Georges Freeman has this idea that we can overcome what Marx called alienation by introducing an organic, a specific form of organization, so that the worker will feel that they are not subordinate to a mechanistic repetition, but they are able to integrate machine operation with their body. That was the theory of the 20th century. But I think that today we are confronting machines with completely different scales. And there was one point made by Masha McLuhan. I think it's a very interesting, very important, also related to your question about the Anthropocene. It is an interview made by McLuhan, I think in the 1980s, when he says that, if you look at the Sputnik, the satellite launched by the Soviet Union in 1953, it was the first time, there were satellites that we can observe the Earth from outside of the Earth. And he said that this is the moment when nature ends and ecology begins. The launch of the Sputnik into the sky is the moment when nature ends and ecology begins, because the Earth becomes an artifact. So there is a different scale that I think the question of scale that is very important, very interesting in this brief commentary of McLuhan, because at the same time you see the idea of the Gaia theory of Lovelock. For him, the Earth or the Gaia is a cybernetic system. Is a cybernetic. The early work of Lovelock, the Gaia is a cybernetic system, and so the cybernetic system, Gaia, ecology, these actually come together. They have this. We can say they have very similar meanings in this perspective. So today we are confronting machines and technological systems of completely different scales. These are what I call organizing inorganic, that they have the capacity to organize, not simply subordinate or could be integrated by the human body. And I wanted to relate this also to what I mentioned before, this Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, the idea of the noosphere. He has this idea that, you know, with the technological development, well, the history of hominization is a history of invention of technology and spreading of technology on the surface of the earth. And he believed that one day we may attain what he called a noosphere, which is a super brain, not a Earth could be understood as a super brain. And Teilhard de Chardin was accused by some Christians that, you know, this is an atheist idea, like a noosphere. And Teilhard de Chardin actually basically he wrote an article to defend himself. He said, actually, the noosphere is a proof of the existence of God. This is because this is precisely a kind of a Christogenesis, and another idea of eschatology. So, if you know, you mentioned McLuhan. What I'm trying to say is, I try to use it. What I try to say that McLuhan's how can we move beyond a paradigm of thought on technology in the 20th century, and we have to adjust what is happening now in the 21st century, which seems to me that many of these theories and terminologies are not able to describe, are not able to respond. So this is something we have to clarify, maybe with new vocabularies, with new thinkings. So, you know, if we are confronting the Anthropocene, as what you said, and can we think of it as, like what Lovelock says, that it is a cybernetic system and we just have to, you know, we have to launch more satellites, and maybe one day these satellites will be able to wake up Gaia, and Gaia will behave in a proper way. I mean, he still has this idea. His latest book, the Nova Sin, is still along this line. So this is a very, you know, the way of understand. Also, because McLuhan also touched upon this point, you know, to see the Earth as a cybernetic system, and what we have to do is to moderate the system so that it can behave well. For me, I see this as a limit. Now, this is a limit of what I try to address in this talk. You know, how cybernetics evolved, or how cybernetics overcome the duality between mechanism and organism, and realized not only in mechanical object but in a larger scale. For example, the Earth. And how can we think beyond this? What I offer as technodiversity, I would like to say that it is not simply a theoretical discourse, but rather to think what kind of technology are more desirable for us, and how can we think of these alternatives. Let me give you an example. If the way, you know, how we are destroying the environment today, it's not simply economical. It's not simply a question of economics. there's a question of epistemology, there's a question of morality, and not only ethics. And when I say that we need to go back to the history of cosmotechnics and to re-articulate it, it's not only technology itself, but also, for example, the definition of human, the definition of nature, which Professor Breves de Castro has done a lot of work on that. So, for example, we have been talking about the end of the human, but what does it really mean by human? We are against humanism, but what does it really mean by human? We rarely think what does it, the kind of relativism of the concept of human in other cultures. For example, in China, we say, what is a human? Human is the being that facilitates the creation of the heaven and the earth. That is a human. Human is to facilitate the growth of other beings, of 10,000 beings, is not to inhibit the growth of other beings, but rather to facilitate the growth of other beings. But so this has been the thought that persistent in China since the I Ching, the Book of Change, until modernity or until modernization. That this meaning, the meaning of nature, the meaning of human, and the meaning of technology are all abundant in favor of modernization, in favor of progress. And if we have to develop a new concept of technology, we have to, because the concept, we can, for me, I don't think that we can single up one concept and just work on one concept, because a concept is always within it is a system and has its own time, has its own epoch. So when I say techno-diversity, the first question we have to, or the first political situation we have to confront is modern technology. If we import modern technology to the Amazon, then maybe there's only one possibility: destruction, burning, and so on. But the other possibility is that how can we resituate these technologies? How can we transform these technologies with other thinkings, with other thought? But this is not an easy task. It's precisely, I said before, there is an incompatibility that we have to confront. But how can we allow new thinking to come out of this incompatibility, new technological thought, new imagination of technology? I think this is a key question that China still have to respond, and we still have to work collectively, not only from the perspective of China or from Brazil. We have to do this collectively. There were two other questions. One is about the second question. Actually, I don't understand very well. Do you want to?
Just a small clarification. What I mean is, how can we achieve diversity of multiplicity, or to put it in other words, diversity that occurs outside the system, not bounded by the system.
Yeah, I mean, this is precisely my point, that if there is such a relation between the organic and the system, if there is such a direct relation between the organic and the system, because the best system is the organic system, since the 18th century. And if we understand it as a system, and the system has to, the best condition for the survival of the system is to have a diversity within itself. But still we are thinking within the system. And the way to think outside the system would be, for example, to rediscover thinkings that are not yet assimilated to the organic. Now, this is a very interesting point, because I mentioned this name, Joseph Needham, many times, and the fact that Joseph Needham trying to say that Chinese philosophy is organismic. For me, I'm doing the opposite. I'm doing the contrary. In the contrary, what I'm doing is to show that don't rush to this conclusion. let's don't rush this conclusion saying that Chinese is organismic and Europe or Occident is mechanical organic. Let's look into the Chinese thought, not framing it first as organismic, but to really to expose the specificity of this, what I call the Chinese cosmotechnics. And maybe this is one way we don't have to pass by the organic, but to show another path. So this is one way of thinking. And for this to happen, we must fragment the dominant epistemology, the epistemologies that dominate our thinking today. So this is one way to think of. I have a logical, but I have an ontological analysis of that in response to this question, which is also an argument that I made through the Cathod's critique of Meillassoux, in the book The Ends of Man, of the world, Ends of the World. But maybe I'm not going to elaborate here because that would be another argument. But the last question concerning what the Greek called chronos and kairos, I mean, this is I'm not sure if I understand which direction you want me to develop, because for sure that there is a question of kairos, of chronos. But can you say which direction would you want me to develop? The organic and the kairos. I would not say that there is organic and the kairos, because what I understand by the kairos is that it's for me a rupture. It's a rupture, it's a jump, it's like a spring. It's not like a chronos, like moving in the linear way or continuous way, but there's certain discontinuity. So this, for me, is a symbol of a sign of the discontinuity. And we can, if I want, I can frame it this way, that right in the 18th century, the organic was a kairos for European philosophers to break away from the Cartesian mechanism. Therefore, that's why I called it the new condition, organic condition of philosophizing. That was a kairos. Well, that's my understanding of kairos and how this continuity plays in the history of philosophy. If that's a very, very, very general answer to your question.
I think we have to finish, but before we do that, Professor Victa, she had to leave, so I'm in charge of finishing. But what I want to say is that it was absolutely great to hear, and I want to remind the people that are here that tomorrow at 1 p.m. at the Facebook of ITS, we are going to have a live with Professor Roy once again, and we will have a broadcast conversation with you tomorrow at 1 p.m. So everyone is invited to join and also ask questions there and be able to watch it. That's going to be tomorrow, 1 p.m. at ITS page. With that said, I have to thank you so much, because I think everyone here was absolutely inspired by your words. 是于老师, 谢谢你们. And please help me to thank Professor Yu Kuai. Thank you so much.